Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Sustainability is simply stewardship with intention, are the words of our guest today, Steve Wooten. Steve is a well-known Colorado rancher and the former chairman of the US Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. He's spent the last 20 or 30 years leading efforts to improve the sustainability of the beef industry across the United States. Steve, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Ash. Enjoy visiting with you many times, whether at UC Davis or NCBA. It's always good to catch up.
An absolute pleasure. Thanks, mate. And so you've been a leader in the sustainability side of the beef industry here in the United States for a lot longer than I've known you, that's for sure. Can you just tell us how that all started and what's kind of driven you to dedicate so much time, effort, and passion into that?
To be honest, Ash, our journey started before the quote sustainability term came around. Um, I'll go back as far as 1979 when I was in my senior range management class at Colorado State University and had the privilege of listening to Alan Savory present the work he'd been doing in the savannas of Africa. And he had come to the United States, set up Center for Holistic Resource Management in Albuquerque. And our soil conservation district had already booked a summer week session with the center at that time. And so what we did in that era of that decade was holistic management. And that was our introduction to grazing management or various different models of rotational grazing and things like that. And so move forward to 11 years ago when NCBA stood up the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, Colorado Cattlemen's, of which I was a board member at the time, was a founding member and drove hard to stand up the roundtable. And I attended that initial meeting where the vote was taken, and then two committees were developed at that meeting. And I joined one of the committees, and that would have included the producer sector. And we started to work. By the next year, I felt like that entire supply chain of beef engaged together, working to better beef, improve beef, assure that beef is environmentally sound, socially acceptable. I was so moved by it and felt dedicated to it that we enrolled our home ranch, Beatty Canyon Ranch, into the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And it's been a pleasure to work on that. We did not pick very easy indicators and metrics to challenge, but we felt like the six that we came up with were the most essential to recognizing the environmental and social and quality side of our beef product, how we could definitely tell a great story of improvement, continuous improvement. And it's been a pleasure to serve in there in that capacity. So it's been a journey of moving through different iterations of resource management since 1979 to today, where now we're talking about regenerative agriculture. And that's because we've got so much science and data coming to us now that wasn't even available pre-internet in 1979. I was still using key punch cards at CSU at that time. And so I think we're not even through exploring what the terminologies are going to be as producers and the whole beef supply chain keeps moving forward in a sustainable or regenerative or whatever we term it in trying to make beef the number one protein source globally and of course here in the United States.
Well, so much really great stuff with all that. I'm not quite sure exactly where to take it, but firstly, I think the Alan Savory angle and the number of people who he has inspired to change the way they look at how they manage their land and their resources and their livestock is just remarkable. And I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Alan a couple of years ago, which was just wonderful. He's quite a remarkable man, and yet someone else who was inspired by Alan. So that I think that's quite amazing.
I agree. I've had the luxury of working with many of the folks that came through Alan's program. Uh, Kurt Godzia with Holistic Management International and Dave Pratt of originally Ranching for Profit. They were early adopters of Alan's philosophy, and that philosophy has been tweaked and changed and adjusted through time to where, like I said, we're doing better now than we were in the late 70s.
So you mentioned back when you started, sustainability wasn't a word, and it's a word I continue to use because I think it's fit for purpose, but it also has other connotations, and like so many things, it gets politicized. So what does that mean to you, irrespective of what word we use for that label? But what does that mean for you and your family and your ranch and your livestock?
So traditionally, when I'm out and I'm visiting other producers at meetings and stuff, you'll often hear the term sustainability is, well, we've been there for 4 generations or 6 generations, so we must be sustainable. And yeah, that's a fair assessment of one definition of sustainability. The other sustainability aspect, and the one that I guess I'm more closely associated with in it, is that the product that we're trying to produce is grass or forages on native pastures. And everything from there starts at the soil level. And so that sustainability for us begins at the soil, comes through with the production of forages, and then we harvest it with cattle. And then it moves on up the supply chain. And so there's a different aspect of the feedlots and their function of sustainability. They have more water use issues, they have more issues of nitric oxide as well as methane production. We have methane production, but then it ramps up more as we move up the supply chain. And then once we get past the live animal side and get into publicly traded corporations that are our retail source for delivery of product to the consumer, that sustainability has an incredible amount of nuances that they have to comply with by regulatory and policy and things like that. So that sustainability varies throughout the beef supply chain, but that's what makes the U.S. Roundtable so unique is that we all work together for each other. Being aware of what the issues are with the retailers at McDonald's, Walmart, Costco, and others, and being aware of what is needed within the feedlot sector, we make management decisions to create a better product that leaves the ranch into the feedlot sector and to the processor so that the product that moves its way through is efficient, potentially profitable at each sector, and ultimately is a product that the consumer chooses because of quality, taste, and price wise is always a factor.
I love what you're saying there with that, I guess, how the different components of the sector of the supply chain work together and how critical that is in terms of that long-term sustainability of the industry, and for the right cattle to be available to the feed yards or the packers at the right time all starts on the cow calf operations, and just the way that information is shared, and that is either a collaborative relationship or an antagonistic relationship, has huge implications for all the players along the supply chain, their financial performance, and that then feeds back into the resources available to feed back into the soil or into genetics or into more efficient processes, whatever they may be. So
Mhm.
I really think that's an important point that doesn't probably get raised enough in this conversation.
I think you're right, Ash, that we're trying so hard on the tools that we have with genetic improvement in the cattle so that the product is both efficient on grass and then efficient in the feedlot, and that's two different components. What we need in terms of of a grass efficient animal. Sometimes we've been told that those animals don't translate to high efficiency once the rations begin to change into a corn. We found that no, that's not the case. That if you balance genetic traits instead of single trait selection, you can have animals that are highly efficient on native forage that have the ability to perform in the feedlot and then produce a product for the packer processor. That's our goal is high choice. Generally, we're about 93% of our steers are choice, sometimes as high as 10% that are prime. And so we're hitting the targets that we think we should be looking at, and it's reflected back by the number of buyers that want to buy the calves from us. And you talked about some antagonisms in there, and those antagonisms are often within the supply chain. We very seldom are in a supply chain from producer all the way to the retail where everybody has a modicum of profitability. And today we're looking at potential profitability in the cow calf, potential profitability in the feedlot, but we're seeing packer processors that are struggling dynamically because of a low supply quantity of cattle available to keep chains running. And so we have a section of the supply chain that is struggling right now. And generally in our cycles, that's going to reverse itself. And we will and have the ability to, within a 2 year period, to turn this low number of inventory of domestic cattle. We can turn it around in 2 years and be back to a very high number of cattle, and then supply and demand switches on us. And so those antagonisms or stress points within the supply chain, they vary based on the cycle in the cattle market, the price by supply and demand changes, and we're all pulling for the same thing, but we've got these outside influences of market structure and pinch points for what the retailers can get from the consumer, and that just flows right back down through us. We learn to deal with it. It's a unique market. It's a unique structured business, but you learn to deal with it and try to plan ahead with it.
That's the antagonistic relation. So when I was in grad school, I did a study of the Australian grass-fed value chain, and the antagonistic relationships there are much kind of deeper than what I've witnessed here in the United States. And what I found out was it wasn't uncommon at all for a producer to book their cattle into two or three different processors, and the day before shipment, they'd ring round the three different processors, find out which one was going to give them the best price, and send their load of cattle there, and just do a no-show at the others. So from the processor's perspective, that company didn't even know what its inventory. It had orders booked in, but it knew that a certain percentage are just not going to turn up. So in terms of how they can manage their business when you don't know what's coming in from a supply side, um,
Hmm.
and that's an Australian example when and the dynamics here are different, but I think it does highlight there's no winners. There's a short-term winner. I got one over that guy because he screwed me over last time. But apart from going,
Yeah.
wow, I feel great about myself, there's no long-term winners from that kind of behavior.
Well, I would think not, Ash. That in the United States, there's roughly around 750,000 beef producers, independent businesses that are producing beef in a various number of methods of beef production. And from our perspective, we have chosen to go with a forward contract process. So calves are born in late February to late April. 220 days later, steers come off the mama cows and get on a truck and they go on to the next phase. Heifers are held back and developed in the fall and then through the winter and sold. Some of the heifers are sold as replacement quality heifers to future developers, and then the rest come home for our own replacement heifers. We will in July use Superior Livestock to forward contract and sell our calves. And whether there was a written contract or not, in the 70s, I grew up with my grandmother and my uncle doing phone call contracts with no written agreement, but a delivery date was determined, and an estimated weight, and buyers showed up with a checkbook, and there wasn't these 3 and 4 page contracts that we have today. But that's in large part because of what you were describing is those guarantees are essential. That there's so many cattle that you purchased through Superior or any other local auction market that they're going to arrive at a certain date. And all those contracts do is make sure that that supply chain has cattle moving through it as is needed by both ends of the supply chain. And it it's it's not exactly similar to that, but it has real bad repercussions if you default. You're financially penalized significantly, and you're building reputation, whether it's through your local auction market at Lahana or Dodge City, Kansas, or Superior or Western Video. You're developing reputational quality, and your brand name is really something that's essential to hold together. And I would believe that that's the same in Australia or other areas where you're trying to develop brand, much like everybody else is developing a brand. We're trying to do it too, but with a live animal that changes to a commodity product.
Thank you. Thanks. I think that because going back while we're still on this topic, I think the the packers need the producers and the producers need the packers. And if you don't, and we've seen in the US, a number of packers have closed down. And given the dispersed nature of the industry, that can add hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars of shipping costs onto the transport to the nearest packer. And where margins are thin, that digs very deeply into profits.
Yeah, I agree, Ash. I'm a little concerned about the Lubbock feedlot that's going to close, a 50,000 head capacity feedlot that's going to close. I'm a little worried about packers that have closed in Nebraska and others that are already down to one, maybe two shifts. That's hard to be profitable when you're only running that facility with one shift, one 8 hour shift. That doesn't pencil. And when this thing turns around, and I still have a lot of confidence that we will come back with a lot more numbers um, in the U.S. supply. But how are we gonna meet that when we go back to larger numbers, more number of cattle trying to get through now, fewer number of packers and feedlots? Um, there's been some talk about the sector moving more towards the Midwest. We left the Midwest because of complications in the Midwest being the central focus for processing and went to a better area of more consistent climate and centralized. So I don't see us making another move back into the Midwest and that being the central location. We built too much infrastructure in another part of the U.S., and that infrastructure is massively expensive to build somewhere else. So I think we've got some real issues coming at us as we move forward in the next 10 years with different supply numbers and the need to move enough product through the system.
And on that note, one of the geographic side of things, one of the your ranch, that land, what is it best suited for? It's best suited for growing native pastures that then can be turned into high quality beef.
Yes. We're in eastern Colorado, southeast Colorado, and it's defined as the shortgrass prairie, which is just above um, a desert environment. South of us, within 200 miles, is the beginning of the Sonoran Desert. So we're functioning at about 11 to 14 inches of rainfall. And grama grass is one of our primary grasses, and then we've got a half a dozen other key grass species, perennial grass species. We've got we've had the luxury of doing some archaeological work on the ranch and did some DNA sampling of some seeds and stuff, and back during the time of those Native American sites, the same grasses of species were found in those Native American sites that we did an analysis on. So I take a lot of pride in the fact that all those species are still there today, being utilized in native prairie and in good shape. It does not lend well to the plow. We're close enough to the Dust Bowl region. That was predominantly sandy soils that were really fragile, but we're close enough to it to realize that dryland farming isn't going to work in this area. And my wife's family did it for 40 years before they put everything back to grass, and it's working better for them to have everything back in grass and not trying to work against Mother Nature with 11 or 14 inches of rainfall. So it's a unique environment. It's great for raising cattle. We don't have to purchase a lot of outside inputs because we can store our protein on the stem and winter graze pastures. And you go east and get into the tall grass prairie in Kansas or north into Nebraska and up in the Dakotas. Those forages don't cure. There's zero quality to those forages in the winter. They need to bale 14% hay in order to feed quality forage in the winter. We're fortunate in this particular region that we can winter graze on standing forage. So that's a part of our overall annual management of pastures. We're going to use some pastures in the spring, some in the summer, but we're deferring so that by the time we get to winter, we've got a significant amount of standing forage that those cows can graze and then just provide some minimal protein, mineral, and salt supplement for them.
And on that grazing management, and I've got some ideas of what it may be given the influence of Alan Savory, but how do you manage that? Obviously, the rainfall is going to be that 11, 12, 14 inches, but it's going to be quite variable. How do you manage that sort of for the long-term benefit of the soil and those pasture species and the productivity of the livestock?
So
I know it's a big question, and it's
it's
not a simple answer, but yeah.
in my mind it's simple, but I've been doing it for so many years, but it's complex in that when you first look at it, it seems like there's a lot of moving parts. And then in a way there are. Um, we're moving cattle based on season. We want our cattle in the bottom of the canyons during the winter because there's so much shelter and protection, live water that doesn't freeze. And then as we come out of there, we're moving into breeding type pastures in that breeding season of spring, and we're rotating through those pastures and then moving up to the high parts of the ranch, the plateaus above the canyons during the summer when temperatures are a factor and things like that. But intermixed in that is a mosaic of, okay, what time of year were we in these pastures last year? We don't want to repeat exactly the same dates, so we vary those dates. We even deliberately in all phases leave pastures ungrazed, and that's our drought mitigation plan. So if we don't get that 11 inches of moisture, we know that we've left standing forage for 2027. And so that's that mosaic of we're grazing some, we're not grazing some, we're varying the timing of grazing with an overall goal of we want pastures to have as close to a full growing season rest before we bring cattle back in. And I'm very adamant about the rest term. Rest is only applicable in my part of the United States from March to October. So early emergence of cool season plants, late growth before a dormant season by frost or by sunlight level. We want those pastures to have the opportunity of the best part of a year. We can't always hit a full growing season, but if we can get 90, 75 to 90% of a growing season, that generally is sufficient to where we're keeping healthy root systems that are dynamic in the soil and keeping soil in good shape and a lot of microbiological activity down in that soil that's essential to the uptake of that plant of high nutrient product. That lets us carry over and like I said, we're in 2026 right now, but we're already thinking about how we're going to use pastures in 2027. And what if 2026 is a drought year? How do we stay in business in 2027? So within that drought management plan, we have trigger dates. March is a trigger date for us, and it's neat you and I are talking about it in March. This is when we're assessing, can we begin the breeding season? And once we begin the breeding season, can we get to fall for delivery of those calves? And this year it's a yes because we carried over so much forage. We've got a little bit of soil moisture right now, so we're seeing some emergence of early cool season grasses. We're still not sure if we're going to go an abundance of new growth on perennial midsummer grasses. But like I said, we've got carryover that we could use this year. The next trigger date for us is June, as we're in kind of in the middle of that breeding season. And where are we at? If we've not had significant moisture and we know we're starting to deplete our resources, then we move into a early weaning plan. And so in July, we'll vaccinate all the calves with their viral protection. Excuse me. And then the 1st of August, we wean. And when you wean the calves off of cows, their total nutrient requirement drops by 35%. And those cows are capable of going out and eating some of that wore out grass that's dry. They'll do fine on it. We'll move the calves to an area where they've got a little bit higher quality on it and supplement those calves till October. But at the same time, we will preg check and we'll cull. So we might pull anywhere from 10% to 25% of those cows out based on what we project, working with meteorologists, what they project for potential precipitation through the remainder of the growing season going into the next year. And then October again is another trigger point where we decide, can we keep X number of cows going forward? Those dates are also coincidental with key marketing elements, whether it's cull cows, calves, bred cows. So they're tied in there so that we're making decisions in advance to pick which class of cattle gets marketed and off the ranch at a point where we can maximize their value to the industry. So if we're in late summer, we're still in a time when the industry demands a lot of beef because of the amount of cookout that's taken place. Bred cows are better sold either at the end of the year or at the beginning of the new year because they're closer to their calving dates. So we get more value the longer we hold that bred cow before we put her on the market. So it's forage analysis, it's marketability, and then adjusting the cow herd based on which sets of cattle are at the highest value for now.
A lot of that comes back to what is that grazing pressure? How many pounds, kilograms of pasture am I going to need to provide to these cows or these livestock over the next period? And and then I guess a big part of that is so that you don't undergraze and have too much there, and no, you're not kind of turning that pasture over and capturing it for turning to protein, and you don't overgraze because of the detrimental um, follow-on seasons if you overgraze the pasture and degrade the soil and degrade the root systems and those kinds of things.
Yeah, there are times, Ash, that we'll use a pasture hard. We'll get caught needing to sit still. There's not enough rate of growth out ahead of us, and we'll sit and we might use that pasture to a 75% utilization that year. But then that's almost like a trigger point for us that that pasture gets deferment next year. So it's okay to do it once, or in my philosophy, and I've visited with a lot of my mentors about it, that it's okay to do it once, especially if you know you've got a healthy root system and everything is in good shape. If you've got a depleted root system, you might not want to do that. It might take it 2 years to recover back. But if you've got healthy, deep roots and you harvest hard one year, then you can leave it and get it a full season growth and not come back to it till 2028. Um, so there's a lot of times that that's happening at the same time that some pastures are being just flash grazed, that we're only in a 3,000 acre pasture for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and we're moving through it fast because we're headed towards a marketing point, say October. We're moving faster to get to that point where we need those steers close to the set of corrals and going to put them on the truck. And so you're constantly very dynamic, and no 2 years are exactly the same. And you're reading what's happening on the ground, in the ground, and then you got your own determined dates, calving date, marketing date, and things like that that are influential in that. Our location is why we have some critical dates of calving and marketing. And there's other areas that marketing isn't a problem. You can vary that based on if it looks like it's better to sell a 750 pound steer calf. There's parts of eastern Colorado and all over that they can wean those calves and take care of them on the ranch or on the farm and get them to 750 pounds. We don't quite have that luxury. We've got our own added benefits that work here, and we've just tried to tweak whatever is the most advantageous management plan for what this natural environment can give us, and we can peel off it as profitably as we can.
You've mentioned, some of the tech you mentioned back when you were at college using punch cards and then moving on to working with the Bureau of Meteorology. And I guess I'm really interested in how much of what you do is hard data and facts and measured figures, and how much of it is intuition and the fact you've been doing it for years, and how do you marry the two of those together?
So we we track our movements using an AgriWeb and a pasture map. We're in two different programs with universities. One of them is fine with AgriWeb. The other one likes to use pasture map. But with these two studies, we're using those. They're just similar. They're just the choices they made. That gives us the opportunity to check back periodically and make sure that we're not double stocking in somewhere that we didn't want to double stock. And then at the same time, we're monitoring on the ground. We still do a tremendous amount of monitoring by eye when we're moving cattle. We move our cattle by horseback. And so we will have a conversation as we're moving out of a pasture. How did we do? What did we think? Did anybody see anywhere that didn't look right to them? So that's that eye of the herdsman aspect of it that isn't technologically advanced, but it's a critical element to what you see. And then I will use a camera system from Enriched Ag, and I'll try to get through a pasture before we go in it. And that camera takes a picture every 6 seconds while I'm driving. And I can get more data to Enriched Ag covering a larger area of the pasture than I can do with Line Transx. And then it's phenomenal. The data they send me back based on bare ground and species composition. They're looking at as many wildlife, insect, birds that I can also get incorporated in there, which is part of the ecosystem evaluation in it. But that system gives us a really good picture year over year is are we beginning to decrease our total amount of bare ground in this environment, or are we at least staying the same? Um, Really critical if we start to see an area that is degrading and starting to increase that bare ground between plants. It can either be by our management or it can be that we're just 2 years through a drought. We've already made herd reductions, but we haven't had that opportunity of moisture to start changing that. And so we're at a point where probably not using those pastures. We've reduced our cow herd. Worst we've ever done is we moved 400 head of cows off the ranch and kept 62-year-old heifer calves and cows on the ranch. Um, we haven't done that. We figured out a better management plan than complete herd reduction, but I would say that's never off the table. Things could go so bad that that's your best option, and so we're evaluating that. Um, as for how we use that data, it's mostly looking back to make sure that we're not making inadvertent errors by not having some sort of data to check ourselves on. And then we're also talking a lot with geneticists, the Red Angus Association. We work with them a lot. We're working with the universities on genetics. And you and I have talked a lot about methane. That's one of them that I think is longer term out there is a potential for determining cows within your cow herd that are inherently less methane production in their system based on the forages. And that's one that we're looking at. There's so many others that are out there. It's created its own micro industry of hustle to get to a product that meets marketing standards. And so we'll look at that. I'm trying to think of other data that we're using right now, Ash, that is relevant to us. I may be missing something right now, but that's kind of how we're using our data and sharing it back with the ranches that we lease. We share that data back with the owners, and then we're also willing to share it with others at grazing schools. We'll put that out there, and here it is. I'll open up the computer, and here's AgriWeb, here's Pasture Map, here's last year's usages, the year before that, and if you like the model, you're welcome to try it. It's not a secret. If it helps somebody, good, go for it.
Is there any extra data or information that you would love to have that isn't currently easily available, or a technology that you'd love to have that's emerging or not available?
So we had not done any soil carbon testing before, and worked with the crew from Noble that was working with the 3M pasture program. And for the first time, we got some soil samples, and we're about to get that data back on soil samples. I think if it was affordable, I'd like to have some analysis in every one of our pastures. I think that would be really relevant to create that baseline of soil carbon in 2026 and then come back every 5 years and test it. I think that would tell us a lot. You know, the folks at Noble want you to do a cross section, dig down 12, 16 inches and take a look at that and that root system. When I was working with them, when they did it for us in one pasture, I could see the root in the core in about a 2 inch core, 31 meter long. I could see where the density of the root system came down through that core. That gave me my first surprise is how we were in a 2 year drought at that point. I mean, that ground was hard as all get out. And I was still surprised at the depth of our roots. I'd never seen it before. I had a pretty good idea based on our management, but that confirmed that we're at least close to being right on this deal if we've got roots that deep in a drought. And I think that's going to be a great tool, but there's not very many available contractors to do that, and they are very, very busy. So getting that done is going to have with itself a cost associated with it, but I think it's going to be a valuable one for us. Um, you and I've talked a lot about, do we need to take a look at what this herd is pitching out in terms of methane? Um, I'm curious about the Red Angus as a breed, and that can we get ahead of this deal and find out if we have a cow herd that is promoted as a highly efficient cow herd, a high maternal breed, but are we truly a maternal breed that's able to meet the standards for some reduction of methane within it? And so that's another one that I've stated of interest in. I'm following what's happening at CSU Ag Next and UC Davis with the green feeds and things like that. But we've got to hit so many different environment levels across the U.S. with dry land like we are, Sonoran Desert in southern New Mexico, and then the Southeast with a completely different model of digestibility and forages and total methane that's produced. So we have a tremendous amount of work within the U.S. beef herd for what is a viable multitude of answers for methane.
I think there's a number of different angles in what you've said there, and on the soil side of things, if you've got roots going down a meter or so, um, you can look at that, that's they're the pores that water will then travel down to get into the soil. So when you do
Yep.
get rain, it'll infiltrate and you'll get less runoff and less erosion. That the carbon in the soil directly impacts the ability of that soil to actually retain that moisture and not to seep through, which once again has come back to when you've got moisture, then you can actually use it to grow grass rather than lose that moisture. Plus deeper roots have got access to more nutrients. So
Mhm.
they can forage the soil for more nutrients. And then there's the climate side of things. If you've got more carbon in the soil, you've got less in the atmosphere. So that's going to have an impact there. So and that's the same on the methane side of things. The cows that produce less methane are very frequently ones that have better feed conversion efficiency. So you're getting more growth or production from that animal for the same amount of pasture than an animal that's less efficient, as well as the climate benefits. So how do you see that tying in between the environmental side of things, the productivity side of things, and then I guess in the nuance of that, it's how you tell that story so that, the city folk or the people who aren't familiar with, cows and ranches in a day-to-day basis, um, understand what the what the priorities are and where the best benefits are.
Ash, we're fortunate that we do a lot of we have different enterprises within the ranch. We have a hunting enterprise and we have a modest vacation enterprise. So in an annual basis, we probably visit with close to 100 people that aren't involved in ranching. And I'm always amazed that they hear the headlines. And then when we get down to visiting and talking about it, that the headlines aren't always quite right for them. They they know the methane and they mess up where the methane comes from and things like that. And so we get an opportunity to maybe help with that a little bit. But in terms of going forward with that, getting that message out of what we're doing and how we're making it happen, that environmental side and that productivity side, it has to be seen together that we can't just focus on the environmental side. We've got to focus on the production side. And there's a lot out there that I don't think the consumer is, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I don't think the consumer herself is terribly worried about it. They're curious about it. They see it in the media, but where the push is coming from is within the publicly traded side of the companies with investors who have a belief that this is important to them, that methane is a problem in the beef industry, and I feel like I want McDonald's or Walmart or Costco to make a decision and make a goal to reduce the methane in the cow herd. That starts to push back all the way down with publicly traded corporations that have tier three requirements. And they've come to realization that tier three is going to be a very difficult model in the beef supply chain and virtually in any one of the food producing supply chains, whether it's wheat, corn, dairy, pork. It's going to be very difficult to do tier three compliance in a voluntary methodology. There is where the consumer hears it is in that part of it. And what we feel like what we can do here on our ranch and what I think all producers feel it, I'll do the best that I can. I'll make changes and I'll describe how we look at it. In 2003, we made a major decision to become a low cost producer. When we listened to Bert Teichert and Dave Pratt and others about the difference between high cost and low cost producers, we had an opportunity because of a 5-year drought that as we come back, we're going to turn ourselves into a low cost producer. And we used to feed half the cow herd on one day and then pelleted feed to the other half of the cow herd the other day. So we were running a truck every day. And we said, no, that's going to end. We're not gonna add rubber, diesel, steel to the window. And actually our actual thought is we're going to lower our footprint. We are not going to be burning those highly expensive pieces of equipment like that. And then we made other changes. We reduced total stocked in hay, and cows are going to learn to live on the land without supplemental hay. And then we're going to reduce the total amount of feed and call it supplementation and match their requirements for producing a cow that can function like God made her to function on native prairie. She can do it, and she can do it and breed back every year. And we have hidden fertility with added inputs for decades. And we talk about efficiency. That's where efficiency comes from, is getting a cow that is efficient do for herself what she needs to do, and all our job is put a lot of grass in front of her, add those few little bit of nutrients that balance her ration, and then let her go do what she's made to do. You start, from my perspective here, that's what we're trying to do is lower our footprint on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Is how can we produce less of what is polluting, whether it's diesel output or rubber that we're running on the ground or steel that we're putting out across there, and multitude of other ways. When you look at your operation, where are we not taking care of the environmental side of the business? And then, of course, on the cow side, efficiencies. We want 97, 95, 97% of the cows bred every year. And of those cows that were bred, anything that wasn't leaves the ranch. Goodbye, girls. We had a great relationship, but we're not wed to you. Of those cows that are bred, again, we want 97, 98% of those cows to bring a calf to branding. And if you don't, goodbye. Inefficiency cows don't work on this operation. They don't work anywhere. If a cow's out there without a calf at her side and producing a product of nutrient meat, she's a polluter. I can't justify her methane output. I can't justify her urine and manure and nitric oxide on the ground because she's not giving me anything on this side of the balance sheet. And so that's how we kind of come at it from the environmental and performance and efficiency side is we tie them all together and try to create a product that when you look at it, yes, we've done some work on efficiency. We've done some work on environmental side. We've done some work on the social side of it. We try to put it all together as best we can based on our location and put that product out there. And we don't quite have the model to measure that one yet. I've talked with Dr. Place and Dr. Stackhouse about it, is when do we start building that model of pluses and minuses, just like a balance sheet? Let's look at methane and beef production as a balance sheet, and let's tell that story so that it's not always about just methane, but it's about this is what society gets from it while we're working on the environmental and efficiency side on the ranch.
I love what you're saying there. I think that's there's it so much of that's about the win-win. Having carrying those animals that are unproductive, you have costs, you still have to feed them, you still have to move them around. You still have to treat them for any drenches or vaccines or whatever's
Yep.
needed, and they're not producing a single cent of income for you, and they're not producing any food for society. Plus, they have the environmental impact. So, it's that win-win which works for everyone. I think they're finding those are the I guess the golden nuggets in terms of where you can move forward. On on the US Roundtable and that where that fits into this, how has that kind of I guess helped you, but also helped other ranchers and also the image of the beef industry in sort of navigating these challenges?
Ash, when the U.S. Roundtable came to fruition 11 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism by producers. They they felt like this is the camel's nose under the tent, that this is going to be regulatory, this is going to be policy, this is going to change the way I do business. It's all going to be about climate. And and there was reason. We had already heard a lot about climate issues prior to the stand up the roundtable. But 3 years into it, I wasn't turned down to come visit an affiliate and talk about it and give updates about what the roundtable is working on. Um, I had some meetings that people stood up and claimed that this was the devil incarnate and don't listen to these people early on, but that changed as they found out that the people that are working on this project really believe in their stake, no matter which sector, whether it's me as a producer or the folks at McDonald's as retailers and JBS and others, that everybody has a stake in this. And if we don't address these issues, the downside is we're going to be painted as a non-caring industry. And that conversation now is comfortable anywhere you go. And I think a lot of producers have adopted the ability that I can be a part of it. I can look at it. I don't know if my business model will let me make any decisions yet, but it's not a bad conversation that's taking place all over the United States now. You'll still see some. I mean, that you've got producers that refuse to buy high level genetics. They can function just in where they at. They've built their little model, their little production system, and it fits for where they're at. So we may or may not get influence into those areas, but it's can we get a critical mass? And whether it's a critical mass of total number of individuals that are using a written grazing management plan to better their resource that they're utilizing, and anything else, it's can we make, and the term we use all the time is continuous improvement. Can we just keep making continuous improvement? We'd love to hit our goals. We didn't set those goals with the attitude of we're not going to hit them, but we understand that we're going to get as far as we can in the given amount of time that we have, but that doesn't mean we quit working. If we don't hit our goal of 350,000, 3,500,000 acres of grazing, written grazing management plans, that doesn't mean we're going to stop. We'll keep going. We'll redesign what we were doing and keep going at it. It's that way with any business is if you don't hit your target, you assess why you didn't hit your target, or did I not give myself enough time, or did we have the wrong message to get that target to reality? We will assess that. And I see that within the roundtable, even as we're working at this, we're running into things that they cropped up as we were in the process. And the most recent one is land use change. We didn't see that conversation coming at all. And it came out of some of the publicly traded corporations, that the concern that there's too much key native ecosystems that are being converted away from their original structure. Um, and so the plow was the criminal, and we engaged with them and we tried to help them understand that, look, the market dynamics in agriculture, some years it's actually most profitable to put corn in. And if you're living in an environment where for 2, 3, 4 years you can corn crop, you can rotate, but then if that market changes, you can have grass back in that area in a short amount of time. Sometimes as short as one growing season. It's different for us. It doesn't work that way for us. But we need that variability out there, and we need to look at things in a large landscape ecosystem where you've got some areas that are converting back and forth. But at the same time, our corn industry, when it's growing, is sequestering as much carbon as a rainforest. And then if we're using no-till operations and we're using cover crops to where we're maximizing the total amount of sunlight and carbon that we're drawing out of that atmosphere, it may not be as stable as a native prairie, but it's not a total negative sink in there. And so we've got so many management practices that we can help with that so that individuals have the opportunity to keep their business profitable. And we made a lot of progress with folks at the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund about that particular issue. And a couple of us with the roundtable, um, we went and did some research. And in terms of total land use change, it's not the plowing up native prairie. It's the commercialization of residential, commercial, and other methods that are permanently taking native vegetation out of production. And that one's a tough one. We do not yet have a model for how we address that. We run into private property rights. We run into the need of communities to grow, people to have places to live and all that. But it is a factor of how long can we go before we tip over from a critical mass of production land for feeding people, that we've consumed so much valuable land that we're reaching a point where it's difficult with the use of technology to supply the food we need.
That's a very a very big and important point, and probably something that would be another whole episode in itself. So,
It's a new one to me, Ash. It slapped us hard 2 years ago when it first rose up, and we went, holy cow!
and
But
that there's
we
so many
decided that
aspects to that.
we decided that the roundtable is the entity, and there was a policy that went through NCBA, and we met this year in Nashville, and it was decided by that committee that we're going to allow the roundtable to run with it. They're structured for it. It's in their wheelhouse. And so they're going to let the roundtable run with it and report back to NCBA to that committee how we're doing with analysis and planning for land use changes.
You mentioned earlier when when the roundtable was first formed that some of the people you went to speak with were not overly welcoming. Let's just put it that way. And on that note, how important do you think it is to speak with people, engage with people who you don't necessarily think you'll agree with?
I think it's essential, Ash. I've probably been working with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy close to 30 years. We saw some of their maps for critical areas of conservation, and that started a conversation with them about what do you mean by this? What's the vision you see there versus my vision for production agriculture? And that's been an ongoing conversation. And when the roundtable was formed, we had every individual and company that has a touch with beef, but we felt like that's not everybody that's involved. And so we included civil society, which is universities, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, the non-governmental organizations, and then our allied industry partners that may not actually touch an animal, but they supply us with pharmaceuticals, they supply us with nutritional needs, they supply us with equipment needs. They're all a part of the beef supply chain and have an aspect to it. Um, Having all that at the table when we were moving forward and we had publications that we were ready to go out with, we turned that over to our civil society and our allied industry and said, you take this back to your sector and you do that analysis. And it's a no holds barred analysis. If it comes back that the baby's ugly, we'll throw the whole thing out and we'll start over. But that was a way that we made sure that not just as many producers as we could communicate with, all those others that had environmental philosophies and environmental issues that were important to them and societal issues that were important to them, they had a chance to comment and feel like we've included that. I think anytime you can do that, that you can sit down, whether it's producers sitting with producers or sitting with non-governmental organizations or universities and have that conversation and build a model that is accepted by as many as you can get, you're going to move forward faster than if you live in a vacuum and you come out with a management plan and then you start hearing all the but what ifs. Now you've sent yourself back to the table to try to work on it. But fortunate that that was the how the majority of the producers in the roundtable felt is we want to make sure that we include all those other opinions and other philosophies into it as best we can.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. We're basically run out of time, but before we go, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
Oh, let me think. We really covered a huge area within this. I want to go back to an efficiency deal, and I think you've probably heard me say it before, but for those that are listening to your podcast or watching, I did a bit of research 2 years ago before I spoke at UC Davis, and I went to the USDA website, the measurements and statistics website, and at this current date, 85% of the nation's cow herd brings a calf to weaning. There isn't a major corporation that would be satisfied on January 1 to know that they're going to be a 15% loss of efficiency before the end of the year. They will make a change immediately. Yet here we sit as an industry wrestling with climate changes and efficiencies, total pounds of beef that's going through the supply chain right now. What if we were 90% or 92% calves weaned per cow? That's a great story to be able to tell that we have moved ourselves to a more efficient industry and a more efficient business. So um, that's kind of one of my goals to keep pushing that forward, pushing it forward, and you'll see universities trying to help. You've seen it in the southeast part of the United States that traditionally they sell one calf at a time. They're now pooling cattle. A lot of counties and a lot of regions are starting to pool cattle to capitalize on that market of being able to move load lots of calves of similar genetics, similar size, and doing the pre-vac work for them and things like that. So there's a tremendous amount of work to increase efficiency, and we just got to keep giving the producers the tools, because if the tools will create profit, they generally take those tools up.
Steve, thank you so very, very much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been fun, Ash, and thank you for asking me. I really appreciate the time to share with you.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud. Please subscribe to Ash Cloud if you've enjoyed this podcast, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political, and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them.